work on antibacterial medicinal plants. And today I'm switching that focus to, again, dealing with bacteria, but on the other side, kind of the probiotic relevance of different microflora found within the microbiome, or the environmental microbiome. And this is a brief overview of a paper that was recently published in the Journal of Ethnobiology. You can find this citation here. It was in a recent special edition on medicinal foods. This isn't working. Can you advance the slide for me? It's not working for some reason. Thank you. So, what kind of captured my interest, this is based off of a field study that we did, Andrea and I conducted in the Balkans about 2 years ago in northeastern Albania. And we were working with a group of people known as the Gorani. And some of our goals during this study were to document, of course, medicinal plant uses, but also the use and kind of relevance of wild foods within these communities. And something that's kind of, I think, near and dear to many of us is this concept of food security. In a world where we have fluctuations of climate increasingly occurring and other factors that impact our food supplies, food security is really a hot topic, I think, for us to be studying as ethnobiologists. Now, food security is really founded on 4 basic pillars. And it comes down to the availability of sufficient quantities of foods, or food availability, the access of local people to nutritious, healthy foods, which you could argue in many cases we lack that, even here in the US. And food utilization, the ability to then process, prepare this food in a nutritious way. And lastly, access to food at all times, the ability to deal with, again, fluctuations in food supplies. Now, on the other hand, there's also this concept of food sovereignty, which I think is something that's really closely aligned with what we do as ethnobiologists and ethnobotanists, and that we're concerned with not just the availability of, or provisioning of food itself, but also the provisioning of culturally appropriate food, right? Things that are well aligned within specific cultural context. And we have the definition here that, again, this is better, that food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agricultural systems. Now, as I was exploring this concept of food security and food sovereignty in the Balkans, we came across a lot of really interesting niche food products. We're also interested in helping support local economic development. So niche food products is one of the areas that I think that the Balkans really has a lot of promise and potential for economic development. But a lot of these foods, we noticed, were being prepared through fermentation processes. And some of you might be familiar with the term zymergy or zymology. This is a term that refers to the science or the study of fermentation. And this is the science, for example, that goes into figuring out which types of starter cultures or lactobacilli go into your favorite yogurt brand, okay? The difference here is that zymology is really focused on the use of autochthonous or fixed, defined starter cultures as you start these fermentations. So as I was working on this paper, I started thinking, you know, what is a term that would really better address this set of knowledge that local people have with regards to fermentation. They're not taking these prepared packets of specific yeast or bacteria to produce these products. Instead, they're really relying on a unique set of TEK to identify species that can ferment their foods in specific ways. And so that's when I proposed this idea of ethnozymology, which is the study of how the science of fermentation in traditional diets, and again, really bringing to light this incorporation of TEK into that mix. And what's unique here is that we're using, instead of the allocthonous or outside cultures, we're using the autochthonous microbiota found on specific plants. Now, I will tell you right now, one of the major weaknesses of this study is that I have not gone and actually isolated these yeast and bacteria. This is something I think that would be really interesting to get some identities on these specific flora in future work. So really I'm focusing on the ethnobotanical aspect of the project today. So what are some of the advantages of fermentation, and why would groups want to actually ferment foods in the first place? The advantages are multifold, and it can range anywhere from diminishing the toxicity of certain plants, and this can be incredibly important when you're dealing with, for example, foods that we might consider famine foods, or foods that would otherwise not be available for use in the diet. You can remove or diminish some of that toxicity through certain fermentation processes. You can also improve the digestibility of foods or make them more nutritious and important for health. You can also, again, enrich it with vitamins, amino acids produced by the microflora during this period. You can also save energy. Fermented foods require less cooking time, or they might even be able to be eaten raw following fermentation. Also, going back to that, those 4 pillars of food security, we can also help in reducing food wastage, right? So making more of the materials available for eating. And importantly to this part of the Balkans, it also improves shelf life and decreases spoilage, and I'll explain why that's important in a minute. So the study aims that we had were to document Gorani, TEK, and fermentation by local plants, again using this idea of ethnozymology, and really digging into this concept of how are these applied in the context of medicinal or folk functional foods, and I'll provide some definitions of that in a moment. We interviewed 44 informants from 2 villages. These are located near the town of Kukës in northeastern Albania. I'll show a map in a moment. But we also used prior informed consent, standard ethics procedures, vouchers, and so on. Some of the data collection methods that we used include semi-structured interviews and focus groups, kind of standard procedures. So here's some of the landscape, just to give you an idea. It's a very rural, isolated area. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in all of my travels. Really breathtaking landscapes to look at from the tops of some of these villages. They are heavily based on an agro-pastoralist economy. Sheep and cattle are raised commonly in the mountains. And again, a lot of cultivation of the land is primarily by hand. And this is the area where these 2 villages are located, right along the Kosovo border here. Again, about a 2-hour drive up into a very rough, narrow dirt road cliffside outside of Kukës. Now, some additional background information on the Gorani is that they represent one of many ethnic minorities in this region. There are about 30,000 that have been documented to be in the Balkans at this time. And they speak a unique dialect. It's called Najinski. It's kind of a mix between a dialect of Bulgarian and Macedonian languages. So really a unique group to work with. Now, I wanted to get back to this idea of, again, the foods that they're using and this concept of folk functional foods, medicinal foods, and regular foods. So as we were interviewing them, I always have in the back of my mind some of our earlier work that Andrea and I completed back in 2001 with Albanian immigrants in southern Italy. And when I say immigrants, these are really the descendants of immigrants that came to the region 500 years ago. And what's unique in these Arborish Albanian villages in southern Italy is that they consume a lot of wild plants that they define as liacra. And liacra are these very bitter wild herbs that they incorporate regularly into their diet. And we found as we were documenting these different plants that some of them are really classified in different ways. And this scheme can kind of help you to see how they're grouped. So there are some plants that they will categorize as being strictly foods, whereas others might be strictly medicines. And in other cases, there are foods that are used for specific medicinal problems. Let's say that, you know, if you have a cold, you should eat this food. So it's being used to treat a specific problem. In other cases, you have what we term folk functional foods, which are really foods that are taken to boost health. There's this idea of health and resilience, that these are just good for you. And they're regularly incorporated into the diet because of them being good for you. So when we were working with the Gorani in Albania, I also found similar reports of this, except instead of having them talk about these kind of wild bitter plants, we found more commonly they relied on these fermented preparations of different plants as filling that role of folk functional foods, foods that were good for them and good for their health. So there were 15 species that really predominated in those that were being prepared through fermentation, and I'll show you a list in a moment. And what I forgot to mention earlier also is that this group is really isolated from the rest of the world for almost 6 months out of the year due to heavy snows. So when we talk about the need for food security throughout the entire year, I mean, they have to live off of what they've made during their harvest season, or what they've been able to purchase in the town, which is, again, very difficult for them to reach. So it's incredibly important to their survival that they're able to create a healthy and nutritious store of foods to consume during that very long winter period. The most common forms of fermentation they use included lactic acid fermentation. This is a non-alcoholic fermentation process. Again, these are members of the Muslim faith, so the consumption of alcoholic beverages is not really permissible. And in a lot of the lactic acid fermentation procedures with foods they would consider vegetables, they use brine solutions, for example. This is like a saltwater fermentation process. Following that, there was also the use of acetic acid or fermentation pathways to create vinegars. And then there are some cases, some more rare reports of alcoholic fermentation to make these rakia, these kind of alcoholic beverages that are sometimes drunk by some of the men, but not very often. But more commonly, they're used as a mouthwash to treat halitosis and dental decay, and spit out consequently after having been made. And another thing that we found that was very interesting is we were asking these questions because they're a pastoralist group. They rely heavily on milk products, on yogurts, cheeses, and different ways that these milk products are fermented. And we asked them, well, what do you do if you don't have any starter culture? If you've ever made yogurt at home, has anyone ever made yogurt at home? You can use some yogurt from a previous batch to start your batch. So we asked them, well, what do you do if you don't have that previous batch? You know, or what if that's not available? And we got some very interesting answers. There are some very specific plants they can go to, and they'll add those to the milk during the process. One of which is the roots of stinging nettle. Another is the bark of a beech tree, Fagus sylvatica. And so that was just kind of fascinating to me, because they had this set of knowledge, again, it was very specific to their environment to serve a certain role in meeting these dietary needs. And here are just some examples of a beautiful meal that I was offered. You can see on the right, those are pickled tomatoes that, again, are pickled through fermenting in a brine solution. And then on the left, this is a kind of yogurt cheese that's created. And you see those big green things, those are actually peppers that they grow. So they have this delicious local food where they store these cheese products throughout the year. I mean, that was more than a year old, which is a soft cheese. You would expect it to kind of go bad, but it didn't. So I'm also interested in the dynamic between the chemicals in these peppers. What role does that have in preserving these yogurt cheeses throughout the year as well? And you can also see a red tomato that's been fermented through the brine process. And in the very back, you can see a glass there, or what looks like lemonade. It's not, that's the tomato brine. And they gave that to me and insisted I drink it because it's very good for my health. So this this will make you feel good. And I have to admit, I think my period in the Balkans was probably the healthiest I've ever felt in my life. I mean, maybe it was just the views, but I think it was all the fermented foods they kept pushing on me as well. Now here are some of the plants that are commonly used to make what we kind of call these fruit sodas. So these are also, again, non-alcoholic fermentation pathways. They're taking specific fruits, oftentimes wild fruits. Cornelian cherry was a favorite, also some Prunus species, and some, here's dog rose, Rosa canina. And these are fermented in these jars. Sometimes they're also fermented in old Coca-Cola bottles, like plastic bottles. And they'll wait until the fermentation process has created some gas and become gassy, and they might add some sugar during this process, or they might drink it with a little bit of sugar. And these are either drunk they call it like their refreshing lemonade. It's their kind of refreshing drink that's good for them. But some of these, especially in the rose family, are drunk in a more medicinal context to treat heart problems as well. Okay, I hate putting up lists like this, but I just feel like I have to show some species. Can you get one more time? I just wanted to point out here the predominance of the Rosaceae. Some of my other work really focuses on rubus species and antibacterial properties of rubus, and I'm really interested in elagitannins as kind of an ellagic acid glycosides as a chemical class. And if you do some digging on the impact of fermentation on some plants in the rose family, you can actually find that you can increase the levels of some of these compounds through this. So this is, again, another area I'd like to explore and kind of see what does the fermentation process do to these beverages in terms of enriching the polyphenolic content or some of these ellagic acid glycosides or other tannins, which might in turn have some really definable impacts on human health. So in conclusion, my take-home point here is that as ethnobiologists, I think we kind of get consumed by the macrobiota, which is a beautiful and wonderful thing to study, all the plants and animals and things that we see in nature and that indigenous people work with. But I think that there's also an invisible biota that we sometimes ignore, but I think that oftentimes local people are very aware of, and they're using this in their food preparation. They're using this in creation of their medicines. And I just wanted to make the point that we need to be cognizant of that and kind of keep a closer eye out for some of these invisible clues and this other aspect to the biocultural landscape, because I think it really represents an area that will be interesting for future studies that explore this dynamic of human health and TEK and foods and medicines. So I just want to first and foremost thank all the study participants that have worked with us. I want to thank our wonderful interpreter, Mez, who speaks many languages and was just an integral part of the study, and the Center for the Study of Human Health, and the UNICEF, and also it's been a long, fun trip working with Andrea. We've been working together for 13 years now. He's gotten gray. I have not yet. So thank you very much.
So, did you notice that there's the connection between the fermented foods and better levels of digestion? Did you notice that there were like maybe fewer of those kind of health problems in this population of people because of their ingestion of fermented food?
Yeah, I did. That's an interesting point. I mean, I think it's something we have to study in greater detail, but there weren't that many, remedies, so to speak, for digestive issues. You're right. Yeah. But again, I can't say I don't have all the data to support that yet, but it's an interesting hypothesis to explore. Yes.
I know you said that you didn't isolate microbes, but so this is sort of a gut punch question. The plants that are used for kickstarting fermentation, do you think, would it be your hunch that that's a local microbial flora of those plants, or do you think it's something intrinsic to the species that it could be applied in other areas of the world as well? Either like an endophyte that's
I think they're very, very specific microflora not one species, but multiple species that grow on specific plants. The microflora that coexist with plants are dependent on the species, the chemistry of the plant. The interaction goes back both ways, right? So you have impact from the fermentation on the plant chemistry, and also plant chemistry impacts the microflora, right? So it's just a fascinating area to explore. It's, again, it's something that's very early, something I just noticed when I was in the field and I wanted to share with you all. So I'm out of time, I have to throw myself off the stage. But now the next speaker is Valentina Savo.